Welcome to boring past times, where history is told not with drama, but with detail. Tonight, we turn to Victorian England, time of factories and empire, of coal, smoke, and candlelight, and of quiet dependencies on alcohol and opium. These stories are not about kings and battles, but about ordinary people, families, workers, and patients whose lives were shaped by substances as common as the tea in their cups and the laudanum in their cupboards. Settle in, let the pace slow, and drift back into the world of the 19th century, where the comforts of daily life carried hidden costs. Story 1. Gin palaces and public houses. Drinking in the age of empire. When you imagine the streets of Victorian London, you might picture foggy nights, the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones, and the faint glow of gas lamps illuminating brick buildings. But among these ordinary sights stood something new, something that changed the way people drank. The gin palace. Before the rise of these establishments, drinking had always been woven into the fabric of English life. Alehouses, taverns, and inns provided spaces where people gathered to drink, gossip, or conduct business. Yet, in the early 19th century, something shifted. The expansion of cities, the growth of the working class, and the cheap availability of spirits created the conditions for a new kind of drinking culture, one that fascinated the wealthy, worried the reformers, and drew in the desperate poor. The gin palace was not just a place to buy alcohol, it was a spectacle. Large glass windows glowed with light, polished brass fittings reflected every flicker of gas flame, and elaborate mirrors made the interiors seem larger and more glamorous. Compared to the cramped, smoky alehouse or the simple tavern, these new establishments felt like temples of intoxication. For the average London laborer who lived in a crowded court or a damp cellar, the gin palace offered a striking contrast. At home, there might be bare walls, little furniture, and constant noise from neighbors. Inside the palace, however, there was brightness, warmth, and a sense of luxury, if it was only temporary. The decor made drinking feel respectable, almost fashionable. The drinks themselves were cheap, sometimes dangerously so. A penny could buy a small glass of gin, strong enough to numb hunger or soften the edges of daily hardship. For women, who were often excluded from public houses, the gin palace was strangely more inviting. Bright lighting and polished surfaces gave a sense of safety, though in truth, many women fell into addiction within these walls. Children, too, could be seen fetching gin for their parents, carrying it home in small jugs. The Victorian economy was built on cycles of labor and exhaustion, and alcohol fit neatly into that rhythm. Men leaving long shifts in factories, dockyards, or construction sites often turned first to the gin palace before going home. Women juggling endless domestic chores, sometimes with additional piecework to make ends meet, sought relief in the same way. For the poorest, alcohol was not simply a luxury, but a necessity, a way to dull the cold, the hunger, or the despair of living in the slums. Yet the presence of alcohol was not merely about escape. It also shaped community life. Pubs and palaces served as meeting places where workers discussed wages, strikes, or the price of bread. They were spaces where songs were sung, stories exchanged, and informal networks of survival maintained. In the absence of social support systems, the public house was, for many, a kind of second home. Reformers, of course, saw it differently. To them, the glowing gin palace was a trap-hand engine of moral decay that ensnared the weak-willed. The cheapness of drink, the ubiquity of these establishments, and the growing evidence of alcoholism among the poor all seemed like proof that society was on a dangerous path. Drunkenness was blamed for crime, poverty, broken families, and even the spread of disease. But this raises a deeper question. Was the problem truly the alcohol itself? Or was it the world in which people lived, the grinding poverty, the lack of opportunity, the miserable living conditions that made intoxication seem like the only relief? As you picture a London street in the 1830s or 1840s, with its mix of ragged children, hurrying clerks, and weary laborers, you might wonder, were the glowing doors of the gin palace an invitation to ruin, or simply a mirror reflecting the harsh realities of Victorian life? To understand why Victorian England drank so deeply, you have to imagine the rhythm of daily life in the 19th century. Factories did not simply hum with machinery. They roared, clattered, and ground on for hours without pause. A man might begin work at dawn, laboring in the damp darkness of a textile mill or the soot-filled air of an ironworks, and not emerge until evening. His body was sore, his lungs choked with dust, his mind dulled by repetition. What greeted him at the end of such a day? For many, it was not a comfortable home or a warm meal, but a cramped tenement where several families shared one privy and one water pump. It was no wonder, then, that the public house became an extension of life itself. To step inside was to find warmth and company, a place where a man could exchange a portion of his wages for liquid relief. Alcohol was not simply entertainment, it was a form of medicine, both physical and emotional. Gin dulled pain, ale soothed thirst more safely than questionable water. Spirits cut through the damp chill of an English winter. The link between wages and drinking was especially striking. In many industries, men were paid at the end of the week, often in cash. Payday Fridays transformed the streets into a carnival of drinking, where workers, still in their work clothes, crowded the pubs and palaces. Landlords knew this rhythm well. Extra staff were brought in, barrels were tapped in advance, and the expectation of heavy custom shaped the very design of public houses. But wages did not always arrive in coin. In certain trades, especially in the earlier part of the century, workers were sometimes paid in tokens or credit redeemable at particular shops or even at pubs owned by their employers. This system, known as truck wages, bound the worker to both his boss and his bottle. Reformers campaigned against it, arguing that it fueled cycles of debt and drunkenness. But for years, it was simply how things worked. Women, too, played a complex role in this drinking culture. Although the sight of women in pubs was sometimes frowned upon, in reality, they were frequent participants in drinking life. In gin palaces, the bright lighting and polished interiors made female customers less unusual, and in poorer districts, women often drank shoulder to shoulder with men. Alcohol was both a solace from unending labor and, in some cases, a silent rebellion against the suffocating expectations of domestic virtue. But for others, it led to dependency. Reformers wrote with alarm of mothers spending household money on gin while children went hungry, though these depictions were often shaped as much by moral outrage as by reality. Public houses, also had social hierarchies within them. In larger establishments, there might be multiple rooms, a public bar for working men, a saloon for those with slightly more money, and private rooms for the well-to-do. Even in drink, class distinctions were maintained. A clerk might sip a modest glass of sherry, while dock workers downed pints of ale, yet both participated in the shared culture of alcohol as a cornerstone of social life. It was not just the drink, but the rituals surrounding it. Glassware gleamed behind counters, pewter mugs were filled and refilled, and the clink of coins on wood marked the steady rhythm of trade. Songs rose, arguments flared, friendships formed, and deals were struck whole under the haze of alcohol. Outside, reformers saw a different picture. The streets after payday were often littered with evidence of overindulgence, men stumbling home, fights breaking out, and women dragging husbands away from the taverns. The press reported these scenes with relish, pointing to them as proof of alcohol's dangers. Drunkenness was not simply a private vice, but a public concern. Magistrates filled their benches with petty cases of disorderly conduct, theft, or neglect, all traced back, in one way or another, to the bottle. Yet, to condemn drinking was to overlook its necessity in a world without safety nets. For the unemployed, a cheap dram of gin might dull the hunger pangs of a skipped meal. For the sick, it might be cheaper than medicine. For the grieving, it offered temporary oblivion. In the context of Victorian poverty, alcohol was not only temptation, it was survival. This tension between condemnation and necessity shaped the Victorian debate on drink. Was the problem one of morality, where weak-willed individuals gave in to vice? Or was it one of society, where economic hardship, poor housing, and lack of opportunity drove people toward the gin palace as a refuge? Reformers tended to see the former, while workers often lived the latter. The clash between these perspectives would only grow louder as the century went on, giving rise to political campaigns, religious movements, and even changes in the law. But in the mid-19th century, as London's population exploded and industrial cities across Britain swelled, the bottle remained a daily reality, an unavoidable presence in both the joys and miseries of ordinary life. And so the question lingered in the minds of reformers, landlords, and working men alike. Was alcohol the fuel of community and endurance, or the root of decline and despair? By the middle of the 19th century, the gin palace had become as much a symbol of Victorian society as the factory or the railway. To many, it was a sign of progress, a glittering building where light, warmth, and social life thrived. But to others, it was a warning, reminder of how quickly progress could turn to decay. The growing concern over alcohol was not limited to moralists or clergymen. Doctors, journalists, and social reformers began to gather evidence that drunkenness was not merely a matter of personal weakness, but a public health crisis. Reports detailed cases of cirrhosis, delirium tremens, and premature death. Mortality rates in working-class districts were consistently higher than in wealthier neighborhoods, and drink was often cited as a contributing factor. Temperance societies emerged as a response. The first organizations, founded in the 1820s and 1830s, initially encouraged moderation, urging people to avoid spirits while still allowing beer or wine. But by the 1840s, the movement hardened into total abstinence. teetotalism became its rallying cry, a demand for complete renunciation of alcohol in all forms. Members proudly signed pledges, wore badges, and organized meetings to spread their message. These gatherings often drew large crowds. In town halls and chapels, speakers described the misery of drunken homes, the poverty caused by wasted wages, and the moral corruption bred in the gin palace. For some, the appeal of temperance lay in the promise of respectability. A working man who abstained could hope to rise in social standing, to be trusted with responsibility, or to gain the favor of employers. For others, it was simply a way out of personal ruin. Many who had lost jobs, families, or health to alcohol turned to temperance as a path to redemption. The movement also found strong allies in religion. Methodist preachers, Baptist ministers, and evangelical Anglicans embraced the cause, linking sobriety to salvation. Sunday schools encouraged children to take the pledge, teaching them to see abstinence as a moral duty. In some areas, especially in the industrial North, temperance became a mass movement, shaping communities and even influencing local politics. But reform met resistance. For many workers, the pub was not merely a place to drink, it was their social world, their relief, their community. To demand abstinence was to strip away one of the few pleasures left to the poor. Employers who supported temperance were sometimes seen as hypocrites, happy to preach sobriety while paying starvation wages. Publicans and brewers, of course, fought back as well, arguing that their trade provided livelihoods and strengthened the economy. Parliament eventually intervened. Throughout the 19th century, a series of licensing acts sought to regulate drinking. Opening hours were restricted, licenses became harder to obtain, and police were given greater powers to control disorderly houses. Yet the impact was uneven. In some towns, strict enforcement reduced visible drunkenness. In others, it merely drove drinking underground, into unlicensed back rooms or private homes. The debate over drink also intersected with broader social issues. Women, in particular, were caught between roles as victims and reformers. On one hand, drunken husbands were often portrayed as the cause of domestic misery, wasting wages and bringing violence into the home. On the other, women themselves were active in temperance campaigns, leading marches, organizing societies, and writing tracts. For them, sobriety was tied not only to morality but to survival. By the end of the century, the drinking culture of England had begun to change. Beer, promoted as a safer and more manly alternative to spirits, gained popularity. Tea, once a luxury, became a staple of daily life, offering a sober alternative that still provided warmth and ritual. The rise of organized leisure football clubs, music halls, and cooperative societies gave workers other outlets for social life beyond the pub. Still, the legacy of the gin palace lingered. The great mirrored halls, with their polished brass and glowing gaslights, represented a moment when alcohol seemed to define an age. They embodied both the hopes and fears of a society in transformation. The hope of escape, pleasure, and community. The fear of decay, vice, and ruin. Looking back, it is tempting to judge Victorian drinkers harshly. But when you consider the grinding poverty, the hazardous work, the crowded slums, and the absence of modern comforts, the glass of gin or pint of ale seems less a moral failure than a human response. Drink was not simply an indulgence. It was a way of enduring, and so the story of Victorian alcohol is not only about addiction or reform, but about resilience. It asks us to consider how people cope with hardship, what comforts they reach for, and how societies choose to regulate pleasure and pain. As you reflect on the glow of the gin palace and the voices rising from the public house, you might wonder, in a world still filled with stress, inequality, and hardship, how different are we from the Victorians, really? Story 2. Laudanum and the Household Bottle. Opium in Everyday Victorian Life. The gin palace was the public face of Victorian intoxication. Then laudanum was its private companion. Behind closed doors, in cramped parlors and dimly lit bedrooms, the brown glass bottle, with its bitter contents, became a fixture of ordinary life. Laudanum was simple in composition. Opium dissolved in alcohol. It was cheap, potent, and most importantly legal. By the early 19th century, it could be purchased from apothecaries, grocers, and even street vendors without prescription. A working-class mother, struggling with a teething child, might buy a small bottle for a penny or two. A laborer, worn down by chronic pain, could find relief in its drops. Middle-class households, too, kept it close at hand, tucked into medicine cabinets, beside jars of ointment and powders. It is difficult to overstate just how ordinary opium was in Victorian Britain. Today, the word opium conjures images of dens filled with smoke and languid figures drifting in dreamlike stupor. But for the Victorians, it was more often a domestic tooling, everyday remedy for ailments ranging from coughs to diarrhea, toothache to sleeplessness. Doctors prescribed it freely, and self-medication was widespread. Children, tragically, were among its most frequent consumers. Preparations such as Godfrey's Cordial or Mother's Friend were marketed specifically for infants, promising to soothe crying and ease digestion. These mixtures, often containing high doses of opium, quieted children not by curing illness, but by sedating them. In crowded households where parents worked long hours and childcare was scarce, such remedies were a grim solution. Infant mortality was high in Victorian Britain, and many reformers later blamed opiate-laced medicines as a hidden contributor for adults. Laudanum was both blessing and curse. Chronic pain, whether from industrial injuries, rheumatism, or the endless strain of physical labor, found relief in its drops. Women, whose health concerns were often dismissed by physicians, used it for menstrual pain, nervous conditions, or simple exhaustion. Writers, artists, and intellectuals also turned to laudanum, sometimes in pursuit of inspiration, sometimes in search of rest. Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas de Quincey famously documented their dependence, blending personal confession with literary reflection. Yet the ubiquity of laudanum also masked its dangers. Addiction crept silently. Because it was taken in small doses, dependence could develop unnoticed, with users increasing their intake gradually as tolerance grew. Families often had at least one member quietly reliant on the bottle. Unlike public drunkenness, opium dependence left few outward signs in its early stages. A person might appear tired, withdrawn, or pale, but such symptoms blended easily into the general weariness of Victorian life. The sale of laudanum reflected the broader character of 19th century medicine: unregulated, commercial, and driven by demand. Apothecaries competed with grocers, and grocers competed with itinerant peddlers. Advertising promised relief for every complaint, from the mildest cough to the gravest consumption. Labels bore warnings, but often in fine print, and few buyers paid them much attention. For the poor, a cheap bottle of laudanum was often preferable to an expensive doctor's visit. One striking feature of laudanum culture was its respectability. While drunkenness was increasingly stigmatized, opium retained a veneer of medicinal legitimacy. A woman sipping laudanum at home did not risk the same social judgment as a woman seen drinking gin in public. Indeed, for many middle-class households, it was part of the domestic order, a quiet secret that accompanied the rhythms of everyday life. At the same time, reformers grew uneasy. Reports surfaced of widespread dependency, of children dying from overdoses, of adults slipping into a haze of addiction. Yet, unlike alcohol, which left its mark in the streets, opium's influence was hidden behind doors, woven into the fabric of private life. This invisibility made it harder to address, harder to regulate, and harder to condemn without acknowledging the suffering it soothed. So we arrive at a paradox. Laudanum was both a symbol of comfort and a source of ruin, a bottle of medicine that could either ease pain or deepen misery, and it leaves us with a lingering question. In a society where pain was constant and comfort scarce, did Victorians truly have a choice, or was the household bottle always destined to become a quiet necessity? To picture the full place of laudanum in Victorian society, you must imagine it not as an exotic substance, but as something ordinary, so ordinary that its bottles appeared on kitchen shelves beside flour and tea, or on bedroom dressers next to hairbrushes and cologne. It was not hidden away like contraband. It was kept in plain sight, a companion to the daily struggles of life in working-class homes. Laudanum served practical purposes. Factories demanded long hours, leaving little energy for parents already stretched by poverty. A child who cried through the night might be quieted with a spoonful of soothing syrup. A laborer unable to sleep from aching muscles might rely on a few drops to ease rest. The bitter taste was unmistakable, but the relief was often immediate. It was medicine in the truest sense to those who had no other options. Among the middle and upper classes, laudanum took on a different character. It was part of a culture of self-dosing, in which people treated their own complaints rather than relying on doctors. Victorian medicine, after all, was far from reliable. Treatments ranged from bloodletting to dubious herbal mixtures, and physicians themselves often prescribed opium without hesitation. In that context, the household bottle seemed no more dangerous than a jar of ointment or a pot of jam. Some used it casually for sleeplessness after a long day or to calm anxiety before a social event. Others, however, slipped into dependence. Unlike alcohol, which carried visible marks of intoxication, laudanum's effects were subtle. A person might appear calm, dreamy, or withdrawn, but these traits were easily mistaken for ordinary fatigue or melancholy. It was possible to live for years in a quiet haze, unnoticed by friends or family. This hidden quality gave laudanum a peculiar respectability. A gentleman dosing himself at night was not seen as a drunkard. A lady taking drops for nerves was not judged as fallen. The same society that condemned gin-soaked mothers in the slums looked kindly or at least neutrally, upon laudanum. Users in drawing rooms. It was medicine, after all dispensed by apothecaries, recommended by doctors, advertised in newspapers. The literary world offers some of the most striking portraits of this dual life. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, shocked and fascinated readers. He wrote not only of the pains of addiction, but also of the strange beauty it brought, the vivid dreams, the heightened sensations, the expansiveness of thought. Coleridge, too, struggled with opium, his dependence shaping both his poetry and his failures. Their accounts created a paradoxical image, opium as both a source of ruin and a gateway to creativity. For some readers, it even seemed alluring, as though suffering and brilliance were bound together in the poppy's embrace. But if literature glamorized laudanum in certain circles, reality was far less romantic. In industrial towns, addiction was a quiet epidemic. Reports from medical officers spoke of mothers dependent on daily doses, of infants sedated to silence, of workers unable to perform without their drops. Pharmacies sold it freely, often in large quantities, and grocers stocked it alongside everyday goods. Even small rural shops might carry bottles, their labels printed with promises of relief. Public concern grew slowly. Unlike alcohol, which spilled into the streets in drunken fights and disorder, laudanum's effects remained hidden indoors. Reformers were troubled, but uncertain. To restrict opium was to restrict one of the few available medicines. To condemn it outright was to ignore the genuine suffering it alleviated. Thus, regulation lagged. While drunkenness was increasingly policed by law, laudanum remained legal, accessible, and largely unquestioned for decades. Doctors, meanwhile, began to notice troubling patterns. Patients who had relied on opium for years showed symptoms of dependency, withdrawal pains, declining health, inability to function without a dose. Medical journals debated the issue, some urging caution, others insisting the drug's benefits outweighed its risks. The language of addiction, as we know it today, did not yet exist. But the recognition of habitual use was emerging, and so laudanum became woven into Victorian identity, at once a remedy, a crutch, and a silent threat. It soothed bodies broken by labor, minds wearied by anxiety, and households strained by poverty. But it also dulled lives, narrowing horizons, and binding people to a cycle of dependence they could neither fully acknowledge nor escape. The paradox deepened. In a society proud of its progress, industry, and morality, why did so many find their comfort in a brown bottle of opium tincture? By the final decades of the 19th century, the laudanum bottle had begun to lose its unquestioned place in the Victorian household. What had once seemed like an ordinary medicine sold freely by apothecaries, grocers, and traveling peddlers was increasingly cast in a different light. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, the tide was turning against opium. The shift was gradual, shaped by both science and society. Medical practitioners, long accustomed to prescribing opium for everything from toothache to tuberculosis, began to acknowledge its dangers more openly. Reports of dependency accumulated, and the language of habitual use gave way to the concept of addiction. For the first time, doctors began to consider that patients were not simply weak-willed, but physically bound to the substance in ways they could not control. Public health reform also played a role. The same reforming spirit that sought to improve sanitation, housing, and education turned its gaze toward medicine. Campaigners highlighted the dangers of unregulated sales, particularly to the poor, who often relied on laudanum in place of professional treatment. Investigations revealed how readily opium was given to children, how cheaply it was sold in industrial towns, and how little oversight existed. The first significant legal intervention came with the Pharmacy Act of 1868. For the first time, the sale of opium and its derivatives was restricted to qualified chemists, and records of purchases were required. It was not a ban. Laudanum remained legal and widely available, but it marked a turning point. The household bottle was no longer quite so ordinary. It was now, in the eyes of the law, a controlled substance. Even so, enforcement was uneven. In rural districts, grocers continued to sell opium as they always had, and in working-class neighborhoods, it remained a cheap alternative to costly medical care. But the stigma was growing. Newspapers published cautionary tales of dependency. Reformers emphasized the dangers to women and children. Slowly, respectability shifted. What had once been a mark of prudence in managing one's health now carried whispers of weakness, even shame. At the same time, alternatives to opium were emerging. Advances in medicine provided new remedies: aspirin for pain, bromides for nerves, chloral hydrate for sleep. None were perfect, and many carried their own risks, but they began to displace laudanum as the default household cure for children. Campaigns against opiate-laced syrups led to safer, if less immediately effective, treatments. Tea, which had become a daily staple, also offered a non-intoxicating ritual of comfort that helped replace opium in domestic life. The literary world mirrored this transition. The romanticized visions of Coleridge and De Quincey gave way to more sobering accounts. Later writers described not inspiration but decline, the wasted health, the broken lives, the quiet ruin brought by long dependence. By the end of the century, laudanum no longer carried the aura of mystery it once had. For decades, it had shaped the rhythms of Victorian life. It soothed infants in crowded tenements, eased the pain of industrial injuries, and offered women a private escape from unacknowledged suffering. It was a medicine, a comfort, and, for many, a necessity. To judge it harshly is to overlook the world in which it thrived, a world where pain was constant, poverty widespread and professional, medical care beyond the reach of most. Even today, echoes remain. The debates over laudanum anticipate modern struggles with painkillers and prescription drugs. The same questions resurface. Where is the line between medicine and dependency, between relief and addiction? How should societies balance compassion for suffering with concern for public health? So the laudanum bottle, though faded from ordinary life, leaves us with a haunting reflection. It reminds us that comfort often comes with a price, that medicine can blur into poison, and that the line between healing and harm is never as clear as we might wish. And as you imagine the quiet rooms of Victorian homes, where a small brown bottle sat within easy reach, you might ask, was laudanum a symbol of progress, or of the limits of a society still searching for ways to ease the weight of human suffering? Story 3. The poor, the sick, and the apothecaries, medicine or poison. To understand health in Victorian England, you must first set aside the modern image of hospitals with sterile corridors, trained nurses, and carefully prescribed medicines. For most people, especially the poor, such places were far out of reach. Instead, medicine came through smaller doors, those of the apothecary's shop, where jars lined the shelves, scales balanced powders, and bottles of tinctures promised cures both real and imagined. The apothecary occupied a curious place in society. Somewhere between physician and tradesman, he was part healer, part shopkeeper, and part chemist. In the early decades of the 19th century, apothecaries were often the only medical professionals available to the working classes. Their shops were scattered across towns and cities, easily accessible to anyone with a few coins to spend. The range of what they sold was vast: herbs, syrups, ointments, and, most notably, opiates. The shelves of an apothecary's shop reflected both tradition and innovation. Ancient remedies sat beside new chemical discoveries. Dried chamomile flowers and powdered rhubarb root shared space with bottles of morphine solution. To a customer stepping inside, the smell was overwhelming: sharp spirits, bitter powders, sweet syrups, and earthy herbs all mingled in the air. Each bottle bore a handwritten label, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in plain English, its contents both mysterious and familiar. For the poor, the apothecary offered something the physician could not afford: ability. A visit to a doctor might cost more than a week's wages, but a penny could purchase a dose of laudanum, and a few more might secure a small bottle of cough mixture. This made the apothecary not merely a dispenser of medicine, but a lifeline. For families managing sickness with few resources, self-medication was common. Customers often entered the shop with vague complaints: a weakness, a restlessness, or trouble with the bowels, and left with bottles whose ingredients they barely understood. The apothecary might give advice, but in many cases he was simply a supplier, leaving the patient to judge their own dosage. In practice, this meant that overdosing and dependence were frequent risks, especially with opiates. Beyond the shops, itinerant sellers roamed markets and fairs, offering patent medicines in bright bottles with grand promises. Labels claimed to cure everything from cholera to nervous disorders. Some remedies were harmless mixtures of sugar and water. Others contained high doses of opium, alcohol, or even mercury. Without regulation, the line between healing and poison was thin. The reliance on apothecaries and patent medicines reveals much about Victorian society. Pain was constant: industrial injuries, infectious diseases, malnutrition, and poor sanitation all left their mark. With no national health system and little state support, people turned to whatever remedies they could afford. In this sense, the apothecary's shop was less a place of luxury than of survival. Yet, for all its importance, the world of the apothecary was controversial. Physicians often looked down on apothecaries as untrained or inferior, while reformers worried about the dangers of unregulated medicine. Stories circulated of children poisoned by careless dosing, of addicts sustained by unscrupulous sellers, of entire families reliant on daily drops of laudanum. And so, as the century unfolded, the apothecary stood at the heart of a great question. Was he a healer who brought comfort to the poor, or a tradesman who profited from their suffering? This tension would only grow sharper as the demands for regulation increased. as medical science advanced, and as the line between medicine and poison became harder to ignore. But for now, as you picture the crowded shelves and the quiet trade of the apothecary's shop, one question lingers. In a world where health was fragile and remedies uncertain, could the poor ever truly know whether what they bought was saving them more slowly, undoing them? By the middle decades of the 19th century, the world of medicine in England had become as much a marketplace as a profession. While the apothecary's shop was a familiar anchor in towns and cities, there was another force shaping the daily lives of the poor: patent medicines. These bottles and packets, sold in shops, markets, Daffy's elixir, Godfrey's cordial, Dalby's carminative, and Bateman's drops were only a few of the countless concoctions that filled shelves and wagons. Each came with a broad set of claims. One bottle might soothe colic, cure consumption, relieve female weakness, and quiet restless children. The appeal was obvious. A colorful bottle with a printed label felt modern and reassuring, even when the ingredients were little understood. For the poor, a small investment in one of these medicines was far cheaper than a consultation with a doctor, and often more immediate in its effects. Yet behind the ornate labels and lofty promises lay a troubling truth. Many of these remedies contained little more than alcohol, opium, or both. A spoonful quieted pain, calmed nerves, or hushed a crying baby, not through cure, but through sedation. For overworked mothers in crowded industrial towns, Godfrey's Cordula mixture, heavy in opium, was a reliable way to send children to sleep. For exhausted laborers, Bateman's drops brought temporary relief from pain and hunger. For those weakened by chronic illness, laudanum dulled suffering, even as it eroded health. The market for these medicines thrived because it addressed needs no one else would. Factories injured workers daily, but compensation was rare. Tuberculosis, cholera, and typhus swept through crowded slums, but hospitals often refused the poorest patients. In these conditions, patent medicines were not luxuries, they were survival tools. Advertising played a powerful role. Newspapers and broadsheets carried endless promotions for miracle cures, accompanied by testimonials, often fabricated of lives restored. Some claimed to be endorsed by nobility, others invoked ancient traditions or modern science. The effect was to convince buyers that they were choosing progress. Reports of child deaths linked to opiate-laced cordials circulated. By the 1830s, pamphlets warned of the silent dangers of the drops. But with little legal framework for regulating medicines, there was no authority to limit their sale. The government hesitated to interfere in trade, and many in Parliament themselves relied on opiates for relief from gout, insomnia, or indigestion. The tension between public health and free commerce grew sharper with each passing decade. Reformers asked, should a shopkeeper or hawker have the right to sell powerful narcotics without oversight? Should desperate families be left to self-medicate with substances they could not possibly understand? Or was such freedom a necessary part of survival in a society that offered so little care for the poor? Behind these debates were countless human stories, rarely recorded. The mother in Manchester who measured out drops of cordial for her children, uncertain whether she was preserving their lives or shortening them. The factory worker in Birmingham who could only face another day's labor with the aid of a few spoonfuls of laudanum. The widow in London who who stretched her pennies on patent cough mixtures. They were symbols of progress, mass-produced, widely distributed, and labeled with modern print, yet they carried dangers as old as poison itself. They were signs of neglect, filling the gap left by expensive doctors and inaccessible hospitals. They were tools of both survival and destruction, depending on how they were used. By the 1850s and 1860s, calls for regulation grew louder. Medical journals condemned the reckless sale of poisons, while campaigners argued that opiates in particular required control. Yet manufacturers resisted, pointing to the freedom of commerce and the profits that fueled entire industries. After all, fortunes were being made from the misery of the poor. Even as reformers pushed for laws to restrict dangerous medicines, the demand from ordinary people did not diminish. A bottle that soothed pain or quieted hunger was not something most families could easily abandon, no matter the risks. And so, the patent medicine industry continued to thrive, even as doubts about its safety mounted. In this uneasy balance between relief and danger, another question began to rise. How long could Victorian society tolerate the unregulated sale of substances that blurred the line between medicine and poison? By the latter half of the 19th century, Victorian society was beginning to confront the uneasy legacy of its medical marketplace. The streets were still lined with apothecary shops, and the shelves of grocers and markets still displayed patent medicines. But the cumulative effects of decades of unregulated drug use, particularly opiates, were becoming too inexpressible to ignore. Doctors wrote increasingly desperate letters to medical journals, warning of children poisoned by god cordial or families destroyed by reliance on laudanum. Coroners' reports quietly recorded overdoses, often hidden under the softer term of accidental poisoning. Campaigners began to point out that England, for all its advancements in industry and empire, allowed its poor to be dosed daily with narcotics without oversight. The pressure for change built gradually. Unlike great political reforms that came with parliamentary debates and banners waved in the streets, medical reform advanced slowly, almost reluctantly. At first, small measures were taken: better labeling requirements, warnings against overdosing, and the encouragement of physicians to guide patients more carefully. But for every cautious regulation, a manufacturer found a way to rebrand, rename, or slightly adjust a recipe. A turning point came with the Pharmacy Act of 1868. For the first time, the sale of poisons including opium was formally restricted. Apothecaries and chemists could still sell such substances, but only under certain conditions, and records were supposed to be kept of purchases. It was a hesitant step toward the modern idea of prescription medicine, though far from complete. Enforcement was inconsistent, and in practice, many families continued to buy and use opiates as they always had. Even so, the act symbolized a growing recognition that medicine could not be left entirely to the free market. The very idea that government might bear responsibility for protecting people from dangerous substances was new, and it reflected a larger shift in Victorian thought, that public health, like sanitation or clean water, was a matter not just of individual choice but of collective welfare. Apothecaries, too, were transformed in this process. No longer merely shopkeepers, they increasingly aligned with the rising profession of pharmacy, gaining formal training and certification. Their role became more regulated, their shops more standardized, their practices more closely tied to medical science. For many Victorians, this was reassuring. The mysterious jars and unlabeled powders of earlier decades gave way to clearer instructions, official stamps, and the slow emergence of trust in professional medicine. But the transformation was uneven. In poorer districts, where money was scarce, and doctors still unaffordable, old habits lingered. Mothers still reached for cordials to quiet children. Workers still took laudanum to face another day's toil. Patent medicines continued to circulate, their labels slightly altered, but their contents often unchanged. The deeper truth was that reform, however well-intentioned, could not erase the underlying conditions that made opiates so appealing. Pain, hunger, overwork, and poverty remained facts of daily life. Regulation might limit the worst abuses, but it could not replace the comfort those bottles provided in a world with few alternatives. By the final decades of the century, medical science was advancing rapidly. Germ theory, anesthesia, antiseptics, and more sophisticated pharmaceuticals began to reshape practice. Hospitals expanded, public health campaigns grew, and the idea of state involvement in health slowly took root. Yet, even as the world moved forward, the quiet legacy of apothecaries and patent medicines lingered. For countless families, they had been the first and often the only source of relief in times of suffering. Looking back, it is easy to see the dangers of this world, the overdoses, the addiction, the exploitation of the poor. But it is just as important to recognize the resilience and resourcefulness that lay beneath it. In the absence of a safety net, families found ways to endure, even if the tools were imperfect. The apothecary's bottle may have been both medicine and poison, but it was also survival. And so, the story of Victorian apothecaries is not just about drugs and regulation. It is about a society learning, slowly and painfully, that health could not be left entirely to chance or commerce. It is about the first steps toward the systems of care we now take for granted. And it is about ordinary people living with limited choices who did what they could to endure. As you picture the quiet shop with its shelves of powders and bottles, the mother measuring drops for her child, or the worker sipping laudanum against his pain, you might ask yourself, how different are we today? For all our advances, do we not still wrestle with the same question that haunted Victorian England? Where exactly does the line lie between medicine and poison? Story 4. Ale and Industry. The Workman's Pint in Victorian England. To picture a Victorian workday, you must first picture the thirst. Factories, workshops, and building sites were hot, noisy, and exhausting places. Coal dust clung to skin, steam filled the air, and the hours stretched long from dawn to dusk. In these conditions, water was rarely the drink of choice. Instead, the Victorian workman reached for ale, beer, or sometimes gin, a habit so common. It became not just a pastime, but a necessity. Alcohol, particularly beer, was woven into the fabric of labor. In many trades, it was expected that workers would drink throughout the day. Builders on scaffolding, dock workers hauling cargo, factory hands at their machines, all might pause at intervals to sip from tankards or bottles. The workman's pint was as much a tool as a hammer or spade, part of the rhythm of industry. One reason for this was practical. Clean water was scarce. In crowded industrial towns, rivers and wells were often polluted with waste. Beer, brewed and boiled, was safer to drink. A pint of mild ale contained only a few percent alcohol, but enough to kill harmful microbes. For many, it was a healthier choice than the water supply, though its effects went beyond quenching thirst. The alcohol dulled pain, eased fatigue, and provided a brief sense of warmth and cheer in otherwise grueling days. Employers recognized this, and in some cases even supplied beer as part of wages. In certain industries, beer money was a formal allowance, ensuring that workers could sustain themselves with regular pints. On building sites, it was common for ale to be delivered in large barrels, shared out among laborers as they worked. The culture of drink extended beyond the workplace into the rhythm of daily life. After long hours, the public house became a second home. Taverns and inns offered not only drink but community, a place where workers could rest, talk, and briefly forget the demands of factory bells and overseers' whistles. For men whose lives were defined by toil, the pub was a refuge as well as a source of sustenance. But the centrality of alcohol was not without cost. The same pint that soothed fatigue could dull attention, slow reflexes, or encourage recklessness in dangerous environments. Industrial accidents were frequent, and drinking on the job only increased the risks. Employers worried about productivity. Reformers worried about morality. By mid-century, critics of the workman's pint argued that what was once necessity had become indulgence, threatening both health and discipline. The debate was never simple, because alcohol was not merely a vice or a pleasure. It was a survival tool in an era of poor sanitation, long hours, and relentless labor. For the Victorian working class, to abstain was often harder than to partake, not because of weakness, but because the pint was part of the very structure of life. And so, when you imagine the clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, and the groan of factory machines, picture also the steady rhythm of pints raised and drained, the workman's hand gripping his tankard as firmly as his tools. For in Victorian England, labor and drink were bound together, one sustaining the other in a cycle as enduring as the factory whistle. But this close bond between alcohol and industry raised a troubling question. As factories expanded, cities grew, and temperance movements gained strength. Could society continue to accept the workman's pint as a harmless necessity, or would it come to see it as a dangerous indulgence threatening the very order of industrial life? If the workman's pint sustained labor during the day, the public house sustained life after it. In Victorian England, the pub was not merely a place to drink, it was a cornerstone of community. In towns swollen by industrial growth, Birmingham, Leeds, London streets were lined with alehouses, gin palaces, and beer shops, each glowing with the promise of light, warmth, and relief. The Victorian public house was a world unto itself. Behind its doors, workers shed the strict discipline of factory bells and overseers. Conversation flowed as freely as drink. Men discussed wages, politics, family troubles, and neighborhood gossip. Some pubs offered games cards, skittles, billiards, while others provided music or singing. For the urban poor, whose homes were often cramped and crowded, the pub was not just a retreat, but a kind of living room that the streets could not provide. The scale of drinking in Victorian cities was immense. breweries expanded to meet demand, producing vast quantities of ale and beer. Gin, once demonized in the 18th century, returned in new respectability through grand gin palaces, their mirrors and gaslights glittering like jewels in otherwise grim neighborhoods. By the 1830s and 1840s, it was estimated that some city streets contained a public house every few yards, each competing for custom. But alongside this thriving culture of drink came growing unease. Reformers worried about the effects of alcohol on family life. Wages spent at the pub, they argued, left children hungry and wives destitute. Employers feared that habitual drinking undermined discipline and productivity. Religious leaders spoke of moral decline, pointing to drunkenness in the streets as evidence of national decay. It was in this climate that the temperance movement began to gather strength. Early advocates promoted moderation, urging workers to drink less, not abstain entirely. But by the 1830s and 1840s, many temperance groups adopted a harder line: total abstinence. Members signed pledges of sobriety, war tokens to signify their commitment, and encouraged others to join what they called the teetotal cause. Temperance halls sprang up in cities, offering alternatives to the public house. Lectures, social gatherings, and religious meetings provided community without drink. Some employers, sympathetic to the cause, supported temperance clubs as a means of keeping workers sober and industrious. Campaigns also sought to limit the licensing of pubs, restricting opening hours and controlling the sale of spirits. The struggle between the pub and the temperance hall reflected deeper tensions in Victorian society. On one side stood tradition, community, and the simple relief alcohol provided from harsh daily lives. On the other stood reformers who believed sobriety was essential to progress, discipline, and morality. Both sides, in their own way, sought to answer the same question: how could ordinary people endure the strain of industrial life without being undone by it? For many workers, the choice was not so simple. Drink was woven into their wages, their leisure, and their very sense of identity. To abstain meant not only giving up alcohol, but also stepping outside the social fabric of one's peers. A man who refused the pint might be seen as proud, judgmental, or even disloyal to his companions. In this way, temperance was not just a matter of personal discipline, but of navigating complex bonds of class and community. Still, the movement gained momentum. By the mid-19th century, millions had signed pledges of abstinence. Religious revivalism lent its strength, while political reformers saw sobriety as essential for the working man's participation in civic life. If the poor were to rise, reformers argued they must first put aside the pint. And yet, as the lamps of the gin palaces glittered and the pints flowed in the pubs, the pull of tradition remained powerful. The pub was more than a vice. It was a sanctuary in a city that offered little else. Thus, the tension deepened. Could the public house continue to thrive at the heart of working-class life? Or would the temperance cause eventually reshape the rhythms of Victorian drinking? By the final decades of the 19th century, the battle lines around alcohol in England were firmly drawn. On one side were the reformers, temperance advocates, religious leaders, and employers who believed sobriety was essential to health, morality, and progress. On the other were the workers themselves, who clung to the pint not simply as a drink, but as part of their culture, their community, and, for many, their very survival. The government, caught between these forces, responded with a series of cautious laws. Licensing restrictions limited the hours during which alcohol could be sold. Sunday closing laws, promoted by Sabbatarians, sought to keep pubs shut on the day of rest. Excise taxes raised the cost of spirits, making gin less accessible to the poorest. Yet, for all these measures, the public house endured. Even as hours shortened, even as taxes rose, the demand for drink did not disappear. Reformers insisted that progress was measurable in sobriety. They pointed to falling gin consumption in some areas, to the growth of temperance societies. They celebrated legislation as a step toward a more disciplined, more orderly workforce. Yet their victories were never absolute. For every pledge signed in a temperance hall, another pint was raised in a crowded pub. Part of the difficulty lay in the role of alcohol as a substitute for what society did not provide. Wages were low, hours were long, and housing was often cramped and squalid. The pint was not just a drink, but a comfort, a means of easing burdens that no law could erase. Reformers might call for abstinence, but until poverty itself was addressed, drink remained deeply embedded in working-class life. The clash between reform and tradition was not only about drink, but about class. Many workers resented what they saw as the moralizing tone of middle-class reformers, who condemned the pint while enjoying their own wines and brandies. The pub, in this sense, was a site of independence, a place where workers gathered on their own terms, outside the surveillance of employers and reformers alike. Still, the temperance movement left a lasting mark. By the end of the century, the association between sobriety and respectability had grown strong. Many working men and women chose abstinence not only for health, but to signal moral discipline and social ambition. For reformers, this was evidence that their cause was succeeding. For others, it was simply another way in which society sought to shape the lives of the poor. The legacy of the workman's pint thus lay in its contradictions. It was at once a source of health, safer than polluted water, and a source of harm through excess. It built community in the pub, even as it strained families at home. It was both a symbol of resistance to reform and, eventually, a measure of respectability. When renounced by the dawn of the 20th century, Victorian England had not abolished the pint, nor had it fully embraced temperance. Instead, it had found a fragile balance. Pubs regulated but thriving, reformers persistent but never triumphant, and workers still negotiating the fine line between indulgence and necessity. Looking back, the story of alcohol in Victorian working life is less about drink itself than about endurance. The pint was never just liquid in a glass. It was a means of coping with poverty, of creating community, of asserting independence in a world of limited choices. And perhaps this is the final question that lingers. When survival depends on more than food and shelter, when it requires comfort, community, and escape, how can any society truly decide where necessity ends and indulgence begins? Story 5. Empire of Opium. From India's fields to London's docks. When you think of Victorian England, you might picture narrow cobblestone streets, smoky factories, and crowded tenements. But beyond these familiar images lay another reality. Empires stretched across oceans, feeding the metropolis with goods from every corner of the globe. Among these goods, few were more influential or more troubling than opium. Opium was not just a local medicine sold in apothecary shops. It was a commodity of empire. Its story began far from London, in the fertile fields of Bengal and other regions of India, where the British East India Company encouraged and controlled its cultivation. Farmers, bound by contract, grew poppies under strict regulation. The resin, scraped from the pods and dried, was packed into chests and shipped across seas, bound for markets in China and beyond. This trade was immense. By the early 19th century, the East India Company had become one of the largest drug dealers in history, exporting thousands of tons of opium annually. Its profits funded colonial administration, fueled British commerce, and tied entire communities to the rhythms of poppy cultivation. For Indian farmers, the crop was both a lifeline and a keen providing income, but often trapping them in cycles of debt and dependence. From the ports of Calcutta, ships carried the chests of opium along routes that bound empire together. Some made their way to Canton, where British traders exchanged the drug for Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk luxuries that filled drawing rooms in London. Others fed domestic markets, ensuring that apothecaries in Britain were well supplied with raw material for laudanum, morphine, and countless patent medicines. At the heart of this trade was a contradiction. In England, opium was both medicine and menace, sold openly to soothe pain, quiet infants, and ease sleepless nights. Abroad, it was a weapon of commerce, forced upon China, despite imperial bans and growing social costs. The opium wars of the 1830s and 1850s were fought not only over trade routes and sovereignty, but over Britain's insistence that its right to sell opium outweighed China's right to resist. The profits, however, were undeniable. Opium revenues shored up the East India Company, enriched private merchants, and poured taxes into the British treasury. In an age of industrial and imperial expansion, the drug became one of the hidden foundations of Victorian wealth. And yet, this global trade was not some distant story detached from daily life in England. It touched households directly. The same ships that carried chests of opium to China also returned with tea, creating a triangle of consumption: opium for China, tea for England, silver flowing in return. The comforting ritual of tea in a Victorian parlour was thus entangled with the suffering of addicts in Canton and the toil of farmers in Bengal. For the ordinary Londoner walking along the docks, the global nature of this trade was visible in the crates stacked high, the sailors unloading cargo, the smells of tea, tobacco, spices, and opium mingling in the air. Few stopped to think about the origins of these goods, but all were part of a system that bound together the health, wealth, and daily lives of millions. The empire of opium was vast, profitable, and deeply contradictory. It was medicine and poison, domestic comfort and international conflict, a symbol of progress and a source of ruin. And so, as the century advanced, Victorians found themselves entangled in a troubling question: could a society that prided itself on moral order and industrial progress continue to build wealth on a trade that spread addiction, exploitation, and war across the globe? If the first half of opium's journey was played out in the fields of India and the ports of empire, the second half unfolded in far quieter rooms, the cramped parlors of working-class homes, the drawing rooms of the middle classes, and the nurseries where children were rocked to sleep in Britain. Opium was never some hidden vice reserved for criminals or bohemians. It was, instead, an accepted part of daily life. You could buy it at the apothecary's counter, in the local grocer's shop, or even from a street hawker. It was sold in small vials, neatly corked, often under brand names that gave an air of reliability. Laudanum, the most famous preparation, was simply opium dissolved in alcohol. It was inexpensive, widely available, and prescribed for almost everything: headaches, menstrual cramps, coughs, diarrhea, toothache, melancholy, sleeplessness, even vague feelings of nervousness. Doctors wrote it into their manuals. Mothers measured it into teaspoons. Mother Bailey's quieting syrup and paregoric elixir. Many of these were aimed directly at children. A restless infant could be pacified with just a few drops of syrup, which dulled hunger, soothed crying, and ensured hours of uninterrupted sleep. For parents facing long days of factory work or the grind of poverty, such remedies could feel like a small miracle. But behind this convenience lay hidden dangers. Infants given regular doses often became drowsy, malnourished, or failed to thrive. In some regions of England, coroners recorded alarming numbers of infant deaths linked to opium-laced medicines. Still, the practice persisted, in part because there were so few alternatives, and in part because society preferred not to question what seemed ordinary. Adults, too, developed quiet dependencies. A housewife might keep a bottle of laudanum in her cupboard, sipping a spoonful when headaches grew unbearable, or when the monotony of daily life pressed too heavily. A factory worker might use it to ease the aches of long labor. Clerks, soldiers, and even clergymen turned to it as a means of steadying their nerves. It was the era's silent companion, carried in pockets, tucked into drawers, rarely spoken of in moral terms. The blurred line between medicine and indulgence was part of what made opium so entrenched in Victorian life. Unlike alcohol, whose excesses were visible in the streets, opium worked in private. It was swallowed quietly, its effects largely invisible to outsiders. To many, it was not a vice at all, but simply one of life's necessities, as ordinary as tea or bread. Yet concerns began to surface. Medical journals occasionally warned of overuse, describing cases of opium habitués who could not function without their daily dose. Temperance societies, already campaigning against gin and beer, sometimes extended their warnings to the dangers of narcotics, dreams, and despair. Still, the drug's role in everyday survival cannot be ignored. In a society with few medical resources, opium offered relief that was affordable and effective, if imperfect. It dulled pain, calmed fears, and provided a kind of fragile stability. In lives otherwise marked by hardship, if you were to walk through a typical Victorian household, you might not notice it at first. You would see the coal fire, the tea set, perhaps a sewing basket or a Bible on the shelf, but tucked away, perhaps in a drawer or a small cabinet, would be a bottle of laudanum waiting for the next headache, the next restless child, the next sleepless night. The presence of opium in the parlor, in the nursery, and in the cupboard blurred boundaries between personal life and empire. The very same substance that enriched the East India Company and fueled conflicts abroad was also soothing the aches of British families at home. But as the century wore on, questions grew sharper. Could a nation that relied so heavily on this drug at every level, from empire to households, continue without reckoning with its costs? By the late Victorian period, the easy familiarity with opium began to fray. What had once been a trusted companion in cupboards and apothecary jars increasingly came under scrutiny. Slowly, quietly, Britain began to recognize that the very drug that had soothed countless aches and powered imperial commerce carried a far more troubling cost. Medical voices grew louder. Doctors documented cases of dependence, noting patients who could not sleep, eat, or function without laudanum. Medical journals described symptoms of opium poisoning: constipation, weight loss, mental clouding, and eventual collapse. What had seemed harmless when taken in drops was proving far more dangerous when taken in steady doses over years. Social reformers also raised alarms. Infant mortality linked to opium syrups became difficult to ignore. Reports from industrial towns revealed that parents, exhausted by factory work, continued to rely on patent medicines to keep children quiet. Some coroners' reports bluntly described infants poisoned by cordial. Though these findings did not end the practice, they cast shadows over the once benign bottles on shop shelves. At the same time, Britain's role in the international opium trade stirred growing unease. The opium wars with China had left a moral stain, difficult to reconcile with the Victorian sense of progress and Christian virtue. Missionaries returning from Asia spoke of widespread addiction and social decay, blaming Britain's insistence on forcing opium into Chinese markets. Parliamentary debates echoed with calls for reform, though they were often met with hesitation. For the revenues from opium remained lucrative, writers gave the issue a more personal and imaginative form. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English opium eater had already revealed the dreamlike terrors of dependency, and later authors echoed these themes. Opium was no longer pictured only as a soothing remedy, but also as a doorway to nightmare, hallucination, and ruin. It entered Victorian literature as a symbol of both mystery and menace, appearing in sensation novels, Gothic tales, and the emerging genre of detective fiction. Gradually, regulation followed. The 1868 Pharmacy Act restricted the sale of opium and its derivatives to licensed chemists, curbing the easy access once available in grocers' shops. Later, measures further limited advertising and enforced clearer labeling of patent medicines. These laws did not erase opium from daily life, but they marked a turning point. The state acknowledged that this familiar remedy was not simply a harmless staple, but a substance demanding caution. By the end of the 19th century, the empire of opium looked different. In Britain, the drug retreated from its place in every cupboard, becoming more firmly tied to the domain of medicine rather than household routine. Abroad, Britain's role in the opium trade was increasingly criticized, not only by other nations but by its own citizens. The same empire that had justified wars over opium now began to distance itself from the trade, even as its effects lingered in Asia, and yet the legacy endured. For generations, families had relied on opium as their quiet ally in suffering. Its bottles, its syrups, its powders had touched nearly every home, binding empire and domestic life together in a shared dependency. The memory of this reliance did not vanish with new laws. It lingered in stories, in literature, and in the quiet caution with which new medicines were received. Looking back, the Victorian relationship with opium reveals much about the age itself, its contradictions, its capacity to normalize what was harmful, and its entanglement of global commerce with personal life. The drug was never simply a substance. It was a mirror of empire, reflecting both the reach of British power and the vulnerabilities of those who depended on it. And so we are left with a final thought. In a world where relief from pain is always sought after, how do societies decide where comfort ends and danger begins? You have been listening to Boring Pastimes. In the story of Victorian England, alcohol and opium were not just vices, but threads woven into daily, life-shaping families, fueling industry, and binding an empire together. These substances offered comfort, but they also carried costs that society could not ignore. History reminds us that even the most ordinary habits can shape nations. Thank you for joining this journey through the quieter corners of the past. Until next time, may your own rest be calmer than the restless sleep of Victorian England.